The 36th Chamber of Shaolin was a movie released in 1978, directed by Liu Chia-liang and starring Gordon Liu. The movie is the movie is quite interesting, and for a while it was known as one of the greatest kung fu films and a turning point for both the director and the star's careers. It did have some sequels, which I'll get to hopefully later, but the plot involves a young man who was part of a local rebellion, and the general of an army comes through and liquidates them all and destroys the school and kills a bunch of his friends. And they're able to, well, him and his friend are able to kind of escape, but his friend ends up dying, and he tries to make it to the Shaolin Temple to escape and hopefully find a refuge and to learn from the masters of the Shaolin Kung Fu. He does reach the temple, and immediately he's rejected at first, but eventually he wins him over, and he's able to stay at the temple and learn Kung Fu. Now, what's really cool is it's called the 36th Chamber of Shaolin for a reason, because in the temple itself, they have the students go through 35 different chambers that focus on training a certain body part or a certain action or art related to the kung fu. So he immediately starts with like wrist techniques, where he's doing a bunch of training to increase his wrist and his strength in his wrist. And then there's like his arms and his legs and like his head, and then individual weaponry and skill sets. And overall, I think it takes him like 6 years or something to go through the entire temple and all the different chambers until he reaches the 35th chamber, which is supposedly the final one. And once he does, on the way, he's kind of tested by another master to see like his skills and prowess, and he always fails every time the master is able to beat him. And eventually, he discovers the invention of the 3-section staff, which is huge, and I didn't even know this, and it's kind of a cool, unique way to introduce the weapon as well, because the way he comes to realizing the invention is pretty unique as well, and you should check it out. It involves like bamboo and things like that, and how it's able to attack from all angles, and he kind of gets the idea for the weapon that way. So anyway, he invents the 3-section staff, goes back and fights the master again, and able to beat him, because I think the master uses like butterfly knives, but he wins. So he finally leaves the temple and goes back to his village to kind of liberate them and rescue the remaining friends. Along the way, he kind of has to recruit some new allies in the village to help the rebellion against the general. And then he comes face to face with the general himself and uses his 3-section staff against him and is able to defeat him. And then he decides to open up a new Shaolin temple, which he calls the 36th Chamber of Shaolin, where it's now him training people outside the temple in Kung Fu instead of just being restricted to Shaolin itself. He wants to teach it to everybody who's willing to learn. So it's a really good film. I kind of believe it's on the same levels of the Legendary Weapons of China, in that it came out around the same time. It's got the same effects. It's almost got the same choreography work, just a slightly different plot. Which brings me to my scores. Now, the story, I'm rating a 6 out of 10 as well. It's slightly above average. It's a little slow at the start, and especially once he's going through all the chambers, you kind of have to wait for him to go through all the tests. You kind of get to see like what he's going through. And it isn't really until he fights the master a few times and then the final battle assault much later in the film that you actually get to see a lot more fighting, because most of it's just training throughout the majority of the film. But I still rate it pretty good, and I would give it a 6 out of 10. The music, again, I'd probably give it another 6 out of 10. It's kind of similar to Legendary Weapons of China in that it's just kind of average. Like, some of it's good, some of it's just kind of mediocre. It just kind of gets you through the film. There's nothing really that stands out too much, but it does its job, and, you know, it's enjoyable, at least while you're watching the movie. The effects are also a 6 out of 10. Again, it's kind of got that same style and feel that Legendary Weapons of China has, where the effect work is kind of just average. Nothing really to say too much about it. However, The fighting is kind of just like, I know I keep saying this, but it's a lot like Legendary Weapons of China, where the fighting is kind of what you'd come to see the film for, especially when he creates how he creates the 3-section staff, which is a marvelous weapon, and you should really check it out. For those who aren't familiar with what it is, it's basically like a giant pair of nunchucks, but with 3 sections instead of just the 2 that a nunchaku has or whatever. And it's slightly longer. I can't remember the size and dimensions of it, but just Google it or something. It's a pretty impressive weapon, and I would actually want to learn it too. But the coolest part about the movie is probably that, as well as the end fight scenes and maybe some of the training. You can kind of see like how the Shaolin Temple kind of was and how they trained all the monks and things like that, the different techniques. And you get to see like, how they trained their arms really big, what kind of tests for their legs or their heads or their eyes and their mind. It's pretty cool. So overall, I'd give the fighting like a 7 out of 10. It's pretty good, but also not like the best I've seen. But, it does its job, and it's definitely above average, so I'd give it a 7 out of 10. And again, on my scale, a 5 is average, and anything above that would be above until you reach like 8, 9, and 10, and things like that. So overall, I give the movie a 7 out of 10. I would definitely recommend it to people who are fans of the genre, as well as people who are fans of Shaolin fighting and Kung Fu, as well as if you like the star, who's Gordon Liu. He does an amazing job. He's been a big part of Hong Kong cinema for a while, as well as anything related to like the Shaw Brothers studio, which is the distributor. They do a lot of similar movies, and I'll kind of review a bunch of them just because they're easily accessible and very enjoyable to watch as well. So overall, my scores are going to be listed above, and the overall was a 7 out of 10. I definitely recommend it, and I believe everybody should watch it when they can.